This is the story of Esther, an orphaned Jewish girl raised in exile, hidden among strangers, chosen as queen in the most powerful empire on earth, and placed in a moment where silence would mean destruction and courage would mean risking her life before a king. Before she ever entered a palace, before she wore a crown, before royal banquets, decrees, and desperate appeals placed the fate of a nation in her hands, Esther was simply a young woman living quietly in a foreign land, carried along by events larger than herself, and surrounded by a world where power belonged to men, empires, and laws that could not easily be undone. She did not begin as a warrior, or a prophet, or a ruler, but as someone vulnerable, living within a story already in motion, unaware that her life would one day stand at the center of a decision where an entire people would either fall into destruction or be preserved through her courage. For a time, her identity remained hidden, and that hiddenness would shape everything that followed, because long before she understood what her position would require, she was being placed in a position where her voice would one day matter more than she could imagine. But placement is not the same as safety, and the crown would not protect her automatically, nor would the palace make her untouchable. And when a decree of annihilation spread across the empire and death was scheduled for her people, Esther would face a choice so severe that comfort would disappear entirely, leaving only two paths before her: silence that might preserve her briefly, or courage that might cost her life. She would not face an army with a weapon in her hand, but a throne with truth on her lips, and in that moment, the future of an entire people would hang not on strength, but on whether she would speak. This is the story of Esther. The Persian Empire stretched across nations, languages, and peoples with a reach so immense that its rulers seemed to command the known world itself, and from India to Kush, provinces answered to the throne, their vast distance only revealing the scale of a power that extended beyond anything most could imagine. Wealth flowed into royal cities, authority was displayed through ceremony, architecture, and law, and the empire stood not only vast in territory, but confident in its permanence. At the center of this world sat King Xerxes, called Ahasuerus in the biblical account, a ruler surrounded by grandeur and attended by officials, nobles, and advisors who understood that proximity to the throne could mean influence, opportunity, and survival. While royal life moved with spectacle and public decisions carried consequences that reached far beyond the palace walls. It was in this atmosphere of wealth and pride that the crisis of the palace first began. The king hosted a great feast for his nobles and officials, displaying the riches of his kingdom and the splendor of his majesty. The celebration lasted many days. The palace itself was arranged like a statement of power. Fine hangings, costly stones, golden vessels, wine without limit, attendants in motion. Everything communicated control, abundance, and royal glory. During that same season, Queen Vashti held a banquet for the women of the palace. Then, at the height of the king's feast, when wine had loosened his judgment and pride had swelled under the gaze of powerful men, he sent for Vashti to appear before the assembled guests so they might look upon her beauty. It was not an invitation shaped by dignity. It was a summons shaped by display. He wished to show her as one more possession within the splendor of his reign. Vashti refused. That refusal struck the court like a fracture across polished stone. In a world where royal authority depended on public honor, her decision was more than personal resistance. It was interpreted as defiance, and defiance from the queen before the empire's elite threatened the king in precisely the place where rulers are most sensitive: public perception. He burned with anger. But anger in a court does not remain private for long. Advisors were consulted. The issue was framed not merely as a domestic insult, but as a political danger. If the queen's refusal became known, they warned, women throughout the empire might begin to despise the authority of their husbands. What began as one woman's refusal was turned into a threat against social order itself. So a decree was made. Vashti was removed. Her position was stripped away, and the empire that had just displayed its confidence before the world now found itself without a queen. It is here that Esther's story begins to move toward the palace, not because she sought power, but because the vacancy created by one woman's fall would become the doorway through which another woman was brought into place. Royal officials proposed a search across the empire for beautiful young women. They would be gathered, prepared, and presented to the king. One of them would replace Vashti. That is how Esther entered the machinery of empire. She did not rise by campaign. She did not volunteer from ambition. She was taken into the process created by royal desire and political necessity. The orphan from exile was drawn into the palace system. Mordecai, who had raised her, instructed her carefully. She was not to reveal that she was Jewish. That detail would remain hidden. In a foreign court, hidden identity can become a shield. It can also become the setup for a far greater test later. Esther listened. The young woman who had already learned how fragile security can be now moved carefully through a world where favor could elevate and danger could return without warning. Among the women gathered into the king's house, Esther found favor. The attendants noticed her. She was treated with unusual kindness. Her preparations were given special care. What this means is not merely that Esther was outwardly beautiful, though the biblical text affirms that she was. It also suggests that something in her presence invited confidence and goodwill. In stories like hers, favor often appears quietly before it becomes decisive. When her time came to stand before the king, Esther was chosen. Out of all the women gathered from across the empire, the king loved Esther more than the others, and he set the royal crown upon her head. The orphan became queen. The movement is remarkable. A girl with no parents, living among an exiled people, entered the palace as one hidden among many. She emerged wearing a crown. Yet even there, Esther's true identity remained concealed. The court did not know she was Jewish. The king did not know. Her position was real, but incomplete. She had status, yet part of who she was remained unspoken. Mordecai continued to watch over her from a distance. He sat at the king's gate near enough to stay informed, near enough to maintain a fragile thread of connection to the girl he had raised, and the woman the empire now called queen. That gate would become important, because in royal stories, gates are places where information travels, plots are overheard, and destinies often shift. One day, Mordecai discovered a conspiracy. Two of the king's officials plotted to assassinate Xerxes. Mordecai learned of it and informed Esther, who passed the warning to the king in Mordecai's name. The matter was investigated. The conspirators were found guilty and executed. The event was recorded in the royal chronicles. Mordecai's loyalty entered the official record, but no immediate honor was given. That delay would matter later. Much in Esther's story depends on timing. Events are recorded before they are rewarded. Truth is hidden before it is revealed. Danger matures before it is confronted. Into this same court rose another man, Haman. Haman was elevated above the other officials and granted unusual authority. The king honored him publicly, and royal servants at the gate were required to bow before him. In that world, such gestures were not trivial. They communicated rank, submission, and order. But Mordecai refused to bow. The text does not linger over a philosophical explanation in detail. It simply presents the refusal as fact. Whether rooted in conviction, identity, or conscience, the result was clear. Haman noticed. His pride was pierced. Pride is often most dangerous when joined to power. A slight that would seem small in another man became enormous in him because he had authority to act on wounded vanity. When Haman learned that Mordecai was a Jew, his anger expanded beyond one target. It was not enough to punish Mordecai alone. He began plotting against all the Jews throughout the empire. This is how genocide often begins, not with immediate slaughter, but with hatred magnified by power, prejudice dressed in policy, and one man's wounded pride transformed into a legal mechanism of destruction. Haman approached the king with calculated language. He described a people scattered throughout the provinces who kept themselves separate and did not obey the king's laws. He concealed their name at first and presented them as a threat to order. He offered money into the royal treasury if the decree were approved. He spoke not of neighbors, families, children, and homes. He spoke of a problem to be eliminated. The king gave his signet ring. With that ring, the decree was sealed. Letters were sent to every province ordering that on a designated day, all Jews, young and old, women and children, were to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated, and their possessions plundered. The language was total. The threat was not local. It was imperial. Haman and the king sat down to drink while the city was thrown into confusion. There is something especially chilling in that image. Power makes its decision. Violence is scheduled. Then life continues at the top as though the suffering below is abstract. But for the Jews, the decree was not abstract. It entered homes. It entered conversations. It entered the body as fear. Mourning spread across the provinces. Sackcloth, ashes, fasting, and lament rose among the people because death had been legalized and given a date. Mordecai clothed himself in sackcloth and cried aloud in the city. Esther heard of his visible grief and sent garments for him, but he refused them. At last communication was established. Mordecai sent word to Esther about the decree, explained the danger, and urged her to go to the king and plead for her people. Esther's response was honest. The law of the court was clear. Any man or woman who approached the king without being summoned faced death unless the king extended the golden scepter. Esther had not been called to him for 30 days. Queens were not exempt from danger. Royal position did not eliminate vulnerability. That is one of the profound tensions in her story. From the outside, Esther looked safe. She lived in the palace. She wore the crown. She had access others could only imagine. Yet when the crisis came, she understood immediately that privilege does not guarantee protection. She too could die. Mordecai answered with words that have echoed through generations. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. He pressed further. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. Then came the line that defines the story. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? That sentence did not remove Esther's fear. It gave meaning to the moment. It reframed her elevation, not as personal fortune, but as possible calling. There are moments in life when all previous events gather into one decision. Everything before them seems like preparation, though it may not have looked that way while it was happening. Esther's entry into the palace, her hidden identity, her favor before the king, even the vacancy left by Vashti years earlier, all of it now stood behind one question. Would she act? That question did not demand an answer. It demanded a decision. Everything in Esther's life now stood behind that moment. The palace, the crown, the hidden identity, the favor she had received. None of it could remain neutral anymore. Silence would protect her for a moment, but silence would also cost her everything that mattered. Esther answered with resolve. She told Mordecai to gather the Jews in Susa and fast for her. She and her attendants would fast as well. Then she would go to the king, though it was against the law. If I perish, I perish. Those words are not careless. They are costly. She did not say, "I will survive." She said she would go even if obedience might cost her life. There was no guarantee of survival in those words, only surrender to what was right. She was no longer deciding whether she was afraid. She was deciding what mattered more than fear. After the fast, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court of the palace. The scene is one of stillness and danger. There are no armies clashing, no crowds shouting, just a queen standing where death may follow in a single instant if the king does not welcome her. The king saw her, and he extended the golden scepter. The first barrier fell. Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. The king asked what she desired, offering up to half the kingdom. But Esther did not rush her request. Instead, she invited the king and Haman to a banquet she had prepared. Why did she delay? The story does not fully explain her internal reasoning, but the delay heightens the drama and reveals something important. Courage is not the same as impulsiveness. Esther had risked her life by entering the court. Now she moved with deliberate wisdom. There is a time to step forward, and there is a time to speak with care. At the banquet, the king again asked Esther her request. Again, she delayed the full revelation and invited the king and Haman to a second banquet on the following day. Haman left that first banquet full of pride. He had dined privately with the king and queen. His status felt secured. Yet as he passed the gate and saw Mordecai again refusing to bow, his pleasure curdled into rage. Honor meant little to him, while one man still stood unconquered in his presence. At home, his wife and advisors suggested a solution. Build a gallows and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Haman agreed and ordered the structure prepared. Everything now seemed to be moving in Haman's favor. Power, access, approval, a plan already in motion. But the story was about to turn in a way no one could see. But that night, the story turned. The king could not sleep. No battle, no warning, no visible threat. Just a restless night that refused to pass. In many biblical narratives, decisive moments arrive through dramatic revelation. Here they arrive through insomnia. The royal chronicles were brought and read aloud, and the account of Mordecai uncovering the assassination plot was discovered. The king asked what honor had been given to Mordecai for this loyalty. None, he was told. A forgotten act, a recorded moment. Now suddenly remembered. At that very moment, Haman entered the court, intending to request Mordecai's execution. Instead, before he could speak, the king asked him a question. What should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Haman, assuming the king must mean him, proposed an extravagant public display. Royal robes, the king's horse, and proclamation through the city. The irony sharpened when the king commanded him to do exactly that for Mordecai. In a single moment, pride became humiliation. The man who came to destroy was now forced to honor. The proud enemy of Mordecai was forced to lead Mordecai in honor through the city. Humiliation had begun before Esther ever spoke at the second banquet. That is part of the quiet brilliance of the story. Reversal begins in hidden ways before it becomes public. The sleepless night, the forgotten record, the mistimed entrance of Haman, the very words he speaks to secure his own imagined honor. All of it becomes part of the turning point. The reversal had already begun, long before Esther spoke her final words. Then came the second banquet. Again, the king asked Esther what she desired. This time she spoke plainly. If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. Then she revealed the truth. She and her people had been sold to destruction. The decree was not against strangers to her. It was against her own people. It was against her. The king was shocked. The threat had entered his own house without his realizing it. He demanded to know who had dared conceive such a thing. Esther answered with direct courage. The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman. There was no more concealment, no more distance, no more careful indirection. The queen who had hidden her identity now revealed it. The woman who had once moved silently through the palace now named evil in the face of power. The king rose in fury and went out into the garden. Haman, recognizing that disaster had found him, stayed behind and begged Esther for his life. When the king returned, Haman had fallen upon the couch where Esther reclined, and the scene sealed his fate. The king interpreted it as an outrage against the queen herself. Then one of the attendants mentioned the gallows Haman had built for Mordecai. The instrument prepared for righteous blood became the place of the wicked man's own execution. Haman was hanged on the gallows he had built. Yet one problem remained. The decree still stood. Persian law, once sealed in the king's name, could not simply be revoked. Esther again risked herself emotionally before the king, falling at his feet and pleading with tears that the plan against her people might somehow be overturned. A second decree was issued instead. The Jews throughout the empire were granted the right to assemble, defend themselves, and destroy any force that attacked them on the appointed day. Mordecai was elevated. He received authority from the king and was clothed in royal garments. The man once ignored at the gate now moved in visible honor through the empire. The Jews, who had been marked for death, prepared instead for defense. Fear shifted. In many places, the peoples of the land became afraid of them, and when the appointed day came, the Jewish communities prevailed over those who sought to destroy them. What had been planned as a day of annihilation became a day of deliverance. Sorrow turned to relief. Fear turned to celebration. Mourning turned to joy. The reversal was so great that it would be remembered in the Feast of Purim, established so future generations would not forget how the days marked for their destruction became days of preservation. Esther's story is remarkable because the weapon she wielded was not force. It was courage joined to timing. She did not command armies. She did not overthrow a throne. She did not stand in open rebellion. She fasted. She approached. She spoke. She revealed. She endured the cost of courage in a place where a wrong step could have killed her before a single word was heard. That kind of bravery is often underestimated because it does not arrive with noise. But entire nations can be saved by one person willing to speak when silence would be safer. Esther remains one of Scripture's most compelling figures because her life brings together hiddenness and purpose, beauty and danger, vulnerability and courage. She was not introduced as powerful in the way empires define power. She was an orphan, a minority, a woman in a male court, a queen whose position still depended on favor she could not control. Yet the story reveals that apparent weakness does not prevent divine purpose. Sometimes purpose is most clearly revealed through those the world assumes are most fragile. Her life also reminds us that placement is not random. The palace was not merely luxury. It was assignment. The crown was not merely decoration. It was responsibility. And when the moment came, Esther understood that her position meant nothing if she refused the purpose tied to it. That is why her story continues to matter. Because many people know what it is to live quietly, to feel unseen, to carry identity in places where it is safer not to reveal everything, and to wonder whether their small position in a great system could ever matter. Esther's life answers that question with force. Yes, it can matter. More than that, it may matter precisely because of where you have been placed. Her story also speaks about evil in high places. Genocide did not begin at the edge of the empire. It began in the center of power, through manipulated language, wounded pride, and legal authority turned against the innocent. But Esther's story shows that evil enthroned is not evil unchallenged forever. Pride can rise high, but it can also be exposed. Decrees can spread fear, but they do not always hold the final word. Esther is remembered not merely because she became queen. She is remembered because she used her position when it mattered most. She stepped into danger for those who could not protect themselves. She turned privilege into intercession. She faced the throne so her people might live. She was the queen who could have remained silent, but chose to speak. This is the story of Esther, the orphan who became queen, the woman who hid her identity until the appointed hour, the intercessor who risked death before the king, and the courageous voice through whom a people marked for destruction were preserved. A story of silence before courage, a story of fear before decision, a story of risk before deliverance, and a story that proves one moment of courage can outweigh a lifetime of safety for such a time as this.